Today we are talking about Reconstruction. This is the period of time right after the Civil War, roughly the years 1865 to 1877, also called the postbellum period. And at this time, there were a lot of questions. Once the Civil War came to an end, you have this new set of questions arising. First off, how is the South going to rebuild its shattered society, its collapsed economy, after the damage that had been afflicted by 4 years of relentless war? Another question is what would be the place in that society for the 4 million free African Americans? And to what extent was the federal government responsible for helping them adjust to freedom? Was the government only responsible for ensuring their freedom, or was the government responsible for ensuring they received all the blessings of liberty guaranteed them in the Constitution? Another question was, should the former Confederate states be treated as states that never really left the Union? That was Lincoln's position. Or should they be treated as conquered territory, subject to continued military occupation? Another question was, under what conditions would the Southern states be fully accepted as co-equal partners in the restored Union? Would they have senators and congressmen like Northern states had, or had they given up that right? Another question is what labor system was going to replace slavery in the South? Slavery was no more, but you still had the requirement for farm labor in order to grow crops and materials to sell and really to survive. So what kind of labor system would replace that? And then one final question was, who had the authority to answer these questions? Is it the president or is it the Congress? So these are really big questions that arose after the Civil War that America really struggled to answer in these 12 years that we call Reconstruction. So Abraham Lincoln planned for the war's aftermath long before the war was over. Especially after Gettysburg, he knew that the North was going to win, and therefore he said we need to have a detailed, organized plan for how to reconstruct this nation that has just been torn apart. And he decided that he was going to show mercy towards the South. He was going to show compassion towards the rebellious states and try to make their reintegration into the Union as painless and as honorable as possible. He said we need to forgive them instead of showing malice towards them. And one thing he said to Grant was that when peace comes, it mustn't just be hangings. Basically, we can't just enact revenge against all of the Southern leaders, even though they were wrong. We need to forgive them and make us a whole country again. Lincoln offered full presidential pardons to all Southerners who were willing to take an oath of allegiance to the Union and an oath of allegiance to the U.S. Constitution, and if they accepted the emancipation of slaves. Those were the requirements for a full presidential pardon for the treason of fighting against the Union. In planning for the establishment of new state governments, which he knew was going to be an issue in the South, Lincoln offered to legitimize any newly established state government once they rewrote their constitutions to eliminate slavery, and if at least 10% of that state's voters took an oath of loyalty to the Union. Now, some thought that 10%, that's a little too low. Shouldn't it be more like 50%? And that's what Congress thought. But Lincoln said that would be ideal, but that's too high of a threshold, and that will prolong the process of reintegrating the Southern states into the Union as a whole. So Republicans in Congress insisted on at least 50% of a state's voters to take the loyalty oath before a state could be accepted back and allowed to form a new state government. In Lincoln's final months, he really set up a plan for a successful Reconstruction. In January of 1865, about 3 months before he died, Lincoln and congressional Republicans secured the passage of the 13th Amendment. This is what officially and finally abolished slavery in the United States. However, they knew that freed men and women would need a lot of help surviving after being emancipated, because the entire Southern society had been built without them in mind, except as free laborers. And so they were going to need a lot of help surviving, because throughout the entire time they were slaves, they were not allowed to learn how to read or write. They didn't learn very many skills except what they needed to work on the farms. And they needed to be taught how to live on their own, take care of themselves, and also be given provisions to help them do so. So in March of 1865, Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau, which was very helpful. It provided food, shelter, and medical aid to those who were made destitute or impoverished by the war. Now, this chiefly applied to newly freed African Americans, but it also applied to homeless whites who were financially bankrupt because of the Civil War. The Freedmen's Bureau's greatest success was in education. It helped establish nearly 3,000 schools for freedmen, including some of the first HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities. And these schools taught 200,000 African Americans how to read in just a matter of years. But then came the great setback, because in April 1865, just a few days after the Civil War ended, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. So the hope for a quick and lasting Reconstruction success really depended upon his leadership, his intelligent and compassionate leadership, and this hope was killed before it could ever be achieved. Now, Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, was very different. He was not a Republican. He was a Southern Democrat. And for a long time, the Democratic Party of the South had been the pro-slavery party. And in addition to being a Southern Democrat, he was very much a white supremacist. And while he remained loyal to the Union during the war, which is why he was granted the vice presidency under Lincoln, he did grant many pardons to former Confederate leaders, not just Confederate soldiers or Southerners in general, but the actual leaders of the Confederacy. And these presidential pardons gave them the right to vote and hold office again. So by the end of 1865, within 8 months of Johnson taking office, many former Confederate leaders were back in office in the South, the same place they had been a year before in the Confederacy. So by December of 1865, all 11 ex-Confederate states had qualified to become functioning parts of the Union again. And Southern state legislatures drew up constitutions that repudiated secession, saying that it was a mistake and they won't secede again. They also had constitutions that negated the debts of the Confederate government or canceled those debts. And also, all 11 of these states ratified the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery in those states. However, none of these new constitutions in Southern states extended voting rights to African Americans, and Southern state legislatures proceeded to adopt something called black codes. Well, what were those? Well, during the time of slavery, there were things called slave codes or slave laws, saying no slave is allowed to read or write. No slave is allowed to travel without a written pass from his or her master, those kind of things. Well, black codes were basically the same exact laws, but they replaced the word slave with the word Negro, or black as we would call today. And these laws very much restricted the rights and movement of newly freed African Americans. It was an attempt by former Confederate leaders and former Confederate supporters to continue a system of white supremacy, even if it was in a different name and you couldn't have slavery attached to it. Freedmen were prohibited from either renting land or borrowing money to buy land, which kept them in poverty. They were also prohibited from testifying against whites in court, which kept the justice system from working in their favor. Freedmen were also placed into a form of semi-bondage and forced to sign work contracts or else be saddled with this immense debt that was created out of thin air by the white supremacists in power. And this contract labor system, in which black people worked the cotton fields under white supervision for deferred wages, saying, oh yeah, we'll pay you, but in the future, this seemed to be very similar to slavery, even though slavery had now been abolished. So the Congress in Washington, especially the Republicans in Congress, said we have to do something about this. We can't allow Southern whites to continue to oppress the people who were freed as a result of us winning the Civil War. So Republicans in Congress responded to these unjust laws by proposing a civil rights bill, a national civil rights bill that nullified, which means made null and void, canceled, that nullified all of the black codes and guaranteed full citizenship and equal rights to black people. However, as you might know, the president has a right to veto any act of Congress, and that's exactly what President Johnson did. He was a white supremacist. He did not want black people to have equal rights in the South or anywhere, and so he vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Then congressional Republicans proposed another bill to increase the services and protection offered by the Freedmen's Bureau to help even more poor people, both white and black. But once again, Johnson vetoed this. Now, the congressional election of 1866, this is when senators and congressmen in the House of Representatives, they were up for re-election. And this gave Republicans a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate. It was a huge landslide victory for the Republican Party. And because of that, over 2/3 of members of Congress were now Republicans. And in order to override a presidential veto, you need a 2/3 majority to vote yes on it. So no longer do you just need 50% plus one vote, you now need 67%. And they got that. And this was enough to override the president's vetoes, and therefore the Freedmen's Bureau Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1866 were passed over Johnson's veto. Republican leaders in the Congress, including Charles Sumner in the Senate and Thaddeus Stevens in the House, they sought to transform Southern society through an extended period of military rule in which black people would be free to exercise their civil rights, in which they would be educated in schools operated by the federal government and would receive lands confiscated by the planter class. These people tended to be called radical Republicans because this was seen as an extreme position because it was such a big and rapid change. Now, Congress overrode Johnson's vetoes, both the Freedmen's Bureau Act and the Civil Rights Act, and this pronounced all African Americans to be U.S. citizens. And one thing that was really important about this is that it repudiated the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision was a Supreme Court decision in 1857 that basically said black people were not allowed to sue anyone because they are not fully citizens, and therefore they can't even sue for their freedom or anything like that. Well, this did away with the Dred Scott decision, overturned it. And it also attempted to provide a legal shield against the operation of the Southern states' black codes. So you have Charles Sumner in the Senate and Thaddeus Stevens in the House of Representatives really leading this push for Reconstruction progress. Congressional Republicans also knew that they would not be in power forever, and so they said we really need to make the most of this brief time, even if it's 2 years, that we have a 2/3 majority and really make some permanent progress. And they suspected that when Democrats regained power, they would repeal the Civil Rights Act and the Freedmen's Bureau Act. Therefore, they said we need a more permanent solution to civil rights issues in the form of a constitutional amendment. And a constitutional amendment is harder to get passed, and it's also much harder to repeal. So the 14th Amendment was passed in 1868, and this declared that all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. were citizens regardless of color. And it also obligated the states to respect the rights of U.S. citizens and to provide them with, quote, equal protection of the laws and, quote, due process of law. Very, very important amendment. Congress also disqualified all former Confederate political leaders from holding either state or federal offices. And then in 1867, over Johnson's vetoes, Congress passed 3 Reconstruction Acts. So over these 2 years of 1866 and 1867, Congress was very, very active. They were trying to pass as many civil rights laws to make life better for Southern African Americans as possible. and they were very successful at that. These acts put the South under federal military occupation. Southern states were then required to ratify the 14th Amendment and to enshrine universal male suffrage into their state constitutions. Universal male suffrage means all men have the right to vote, regardless of color. Now, one of the generals sent to the South to protect freedmen, specifically against the KKK, which had just formed, and to ensure that federal laws were being followed, was Ulysses S. Grant, the great general of the Union during the Civil War who secured the victory at the end. He was then sent to the South to enforce these laws that were being passed by Congress. So after slavery was abolished, the South's agrarian or agricultural economy transitioned to a system known as sharecropping. And sharecropping was not slavery. It was definitely better than slavery, but it wasn't much better. It wasn't as fair and just as we would have liked. Because under this system, the landlord, who was often a former slave owner, provided the seed, provided the farm supplies to a group of poor laborers, and then these laborers would live on their landlord's property and work their land. Now, these laborers were both freed African Americans and poor whites. So there were a lot of white sharecroppers, just like there were a lot of black sharecroppers. And in exchange for the land, seed, and supplies that were provided by their landlords, the sharecroppers who did all the labor would usually have to give the landholders a share of their harvested crop, usually about half. Now, this prevented the laborers themselves, the sharecroppers, from making any kind of meaningful profit, and also kept them poor. Dependent on their landowners, they were deeply in debt, and by 1880, which is 15 years after the slavery ended and sharecropping began, only 5% of black people in the South had become landowners. And this system actually existed for nearly 100 years until the 1960s. So it was a system that wasn't quite slavery, but at the same time, it was similar to serfdom in Europe, which had been long abolished by this point. But it basically kept poor people poor, and it ensured that those who had land before emancipation kept their land. Freedmen viewed emancipation as an opportunity for becoming independent of white control over their lives. And because of this, you have a lot of black communities establishing their own institutions. And this led to the founding of hundreds of independent black churches during Reconstruction. For example, the AME Church, or African Methodist Episcopal Church, the Missionary Baptist Church, many of the churches we now consider to be black churches were started during Reconstruction. Black ministers became leading voices in the black community and became very influential, which they still are today. You also have independent black schools being established, including Howard University in Washington, Fisk University, and the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Other freedmen moved from the South to western states, places like Kansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma, where they didn't have to be sharecroppers and didn't have to face the dangers of violence from white supremacists. And these people who moved to the West were known as exodusters. The Exodus in the Bible was the great departure of former slaves, and therefore these individuals were known as exodusters. Now, in 1867, over Johnson's veto, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, and this is something that prohibited the president from firing a member of his cabinet without Congress's approval. Now, this is not exactly constitutional. The second article of the Constitution essentially says that a president has a right to appoint members of his cabinet. However, this law was basically trying to prevent President Johnson from firing any of the Lincoln appointees, the Republicans who were still in his cabinet, which Johnson wanted to do. So in 1868, Johnson went against this law. He fired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, someone who had been appointed by Lincoln, and he was the Republican who oversaw the military governments in the South, and Johnson fired him. Well, this is when Congress pounced. The House reacted by impeaching Johnson. Now, to impeach a president means to call for his removal from office. Now, the House of Representatives can impeach a president if they get a 50 plus 1% majority, 50% plus 1 majority that says he is guilty and should leave office. That's called being impeached. Now, the president does not get thrown out of office if he is impeached by the House. He then has to be convicted by the Senate. So after a president is impeached by the House of Representatives, the case then goes to the Senate, and in the Senate, you need a 2/3 majority to convict the president and kick him out of office. Now, the first part, the impeachment, has happened to 3 presidents. The second part, the conviction and removal of from office, has not happened to any presidents. Okay, and this was the first one here with Andrew Johnson. The House charged him with 11 high crimes and misdemeanors. And in 1868, after a 3-month trial in the Senate, Johnson was acquitted by just 1 vote. He was not convicted, and he was able to remain in office until the end of his term in 1869. So with this, you have an important precedent being set. The example of an opposing party in power in Congress trying to remove a president from office simply because they really don't like him. That's really the only reason why Republicans were trying to get Johnson out of office, because he was a roadblock to their civil rights efforts, and he wasn't a very good president. And so they wanted him out. They wanted a Republican in, and because of that, they were trying to get him out of office by charging him for a fairly minor breach of law. And this example of a Congress impeaching or threatening to impeach a president for purely political reasons, this would be repeated several more times in U.S. history, including in recent times. All right, the election of 1868. Johnson did not get the Democratic presidential nomination for the 1868 election. That's how unpopular he was. He was even unpopular in his own party. And Republicans nominated Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Grant had no political experience before this point, but he was a war hero, and he was politically very similar to the late Abraham Lincoln, which is what most Republicans wanted. On the campaign trail, Grant stated, quote, "I have no prejudice against any sect or race, but want each individual to be judged by his own merit." So he was very much not a white supremacist, not a racist, but someone who wanted everyone to have the chance to prove himself and to make a life for him or herself. In 1868, this was the first election in which African Americans could vote, and thanks to 500,000 black voters, Grant won the presidency, and Republicans gained even more seats in Congress. In 1870, Congress passed the 15th Amendment. This was the third of the 3 Reconstruction Amendments. Remember, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to African Americans, and now the 15th Amendment gave the right to vote to all black men. And this prohibited any state from denying a citizen's right to vote, quote, on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And Grant signed this into law. Now, during Grant's presidency, many black people held positions in the U.S. Senate and in the U.S. House of Representatives. You had about a dozen African Americans being elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, mostly from southern states. You also have many state governments being filled with black leaders who were voted for by the populations of the South. And you even had 2 U.S. senators, 2 African Americans being elected to the U.S. Senate, Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce, both of whom represented Mississippi. One of Grant's missions was to protect both the lives and the rights of recently freed African Americans, both of which he knew were under threat in the Reconstruction South, the postbellum South. And to do this, he created the Department of Justice, something that still exists today with the Attorney General. And the reason why he created the Department of Justice was to break up the newly formed white supremacist terrorist group, the Ku Klux Klan, something that was founded just 2 years after the Civil War ended. A former Confederate general was the first leader of the KKK, and the mission of the KKK was basically to terrorize anyone they considered to be a threat to their worldview. Primarily, their target was black people, but they also targeted whites who they believed treated blacks as equals. For example, Republicans were a big target for KKK members. They also targeted Jews, Catholics, and immigrants. And Grant knew this was a problem. He knew this was not okay for black people to be in more danger, even though now they were free, which was the case. And so he created the Department of Justice to break up the KKK and to prosecute members of the KKK who continued to do violence illegally. He signed the Force Acts of 1870 and 1871, which utilized federal troops to combat the violence and terrorism of groups like the KKK. In 1875, Grant signed a Civil Rights Act that prohibited various forms of racial segregation. Now, this was way before the Civil Rights Movement. You have segregation being outlawed by a federal law signed by Grant. For example, it prohibited courts from excluding African Americans from juries. Grant also advocated for the rights of Indians. He was someone who very much believed in the equality of all people. In fact, one of Grant's biggest supporters was none other than Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, speaker, and writer who was born and raised in slavery, escaped, and became a great advocate for those who didn't have a voice, and a big abolitionist. And Frederick Douglass said of Grant, he said, quote, "In him the Negro found a protector, the Indian a friend, a vanquished foe a brother, an imperiled nation a savior." So Grant is exactly what America needed at this very, very delicate time. Now, unfortunately, after Grant left office, after the 8 years that he was in office and so much progress had happened, he left office in 1877 and Reconstruction ended immediately. And much of the progress that he had made was erased. And it would be another 70 years before such racial progress would begin again with the Civil Rights Movement. So the progress made during the 12 years of Reconstruction, especially during Grant's 8 years, was very considerable. It should not be ignored because it was really, really impressive and helped many, many people. For example, hundreds of African Americans were elected to positions in state governments, dozens were elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and 2 were elected to the U.S. Senate. You even had one African American being elected the governor of Louisiana, the first black governor in U.S. history, Pinckney Pinchback. Congressional Republicans brought about universal male suffrage, voting rights for all men, even black men, property rights, debt relief for the poor. They built roads, bridges, and railroads in the South, really reconstructed the infrastructure that had been destroyed in the South. They also established hospitals, asylums, and public schools in the South. The KKK was disbanded, and federal troops occupied the South to ensure the enforcement of civil rights laws. So really, for these 12 years here, America was more free than it had ever been before, and people believed that this progress would continue. But tragically, it did not. The rapid and substantial progress brought about during Reconstruction would be stopped and actually erased during the Gilded Age, which took place in the following 20 or so years. The presidential election of 1876 is the reason for this. So after Grant had served his 2 terms, the Republican Party elected a different person, Rutherford B. Hayes, and the Democratic Party elected Samuel Tilden as their nominee. And this election was very hotly contested. Neither candidate received enough non-disputed electoral votes to win the election. Therefore, as the Constitution says you have to do, a special commission was created in Congress to determine who won this presidential election. Well, a committee of 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats made a very fateful decision that was known as the Compromise of 1877. And this is what finally ended Reconstruction and made life so much worse in the South, especially for black people, for the next 70 plus years, the era of Jim Crow and segregation. The Compromise of 1877 stated that Rutherford B. Hayes would become president on the condition that federal troops were removed from the South. So this was the compromise because it pleased Republicans that Republican Rutherford B. Hayes would be president, but it also pleased Democrats because federal troops would be removed from the South, which would permit them to start oppressing African Americans again. So no more federal troops in the South, which means no more protection and no more enforcement of all the great civil rights legislation that had been passed. And laws are great as long as they are enforced. But if you have a law on the books, but you refuse to enforce it, then it's like not having the law at all. So yeah, by law, black people were equal in this country starting during Reconstruction onward. However, since that equality was not enforced in the South after 1877, that equality was not real until the Civil Rights Movement when it started to be enforced again. So upon becoming president, Hayes removed federal troops, and without the protection of federal troops, black people began to be terrorized again. You had the KKK terrorizing people again. Black voting rights were very much restricted, and white supremacist Democrats regained control of every southern state. This ended Reconstruction. All of the progress that had been brought about and began this period of segregation and Jim Crow laws. All the progress was erased, and the period known as the Nadir began. African Americans, who had really been freer and more equal than ever for the past 12 years, became very much oppressed again, disenfranchised, brutalized, impoverished, and really less safe than ever. Because when there was slavery, there was at least the sense that, well, at least their masters want to keep them alive because they're profitable. But now that they're not properties, not seen as property anymore, their lives are more at risk, and therefore there was a lot more murder and terrorism and violence against black people during this time, even more than during the age of slavery. And this era tragically would last until the mid-20th century.